Okay, we're back with part 7, and we set up a very simple animation here. The only thing that I've done at all is to rotate the neck of our Victoria 4 character. And remember, because the proxy is being fitted to her like conforming clothing, that as she rotates her head, then the proxy rotates its head and the hair follows. And so you'll see it's a very simple animation. For the first second of the animation, there is no movement at all, and during that period of time, I just want the hair to settle from its normal position that we've got it to a position that it would normally be at with gravity. So we just want to settle it down, and then as we scrub through, you're going to see that she turns her head to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left, the right, and back to the center, like so. So very, very simple animation. We're not aiming for anything really big here, because the only purpose of this animation that we're creating is so that we can see the effects of the dynamic hair. And I want you guys at home to set something up like this so that you can test and change parameters and have renders that go very, very quickly. So you can render out in 5 minutes or so an animation of 4 seconds and see how the hair moves and see if that's to your liking, so that you can quickly make your own hairstyles and see the effect of it almost immediately. And so what we're going to do now is just do the conversion, or the simulation. So let's go back to our hair, because that's what's being simulated. I've got it at the first frame over here. Go to our simulation tab here in the hair, and there's some settings that are pretty much identical to the settings that are in the hair room, but I'll just do it out here in the assembly room. I want the collisions to be enabled so it doesn't fall through the head or anything. Simulation strength is about 200%, where I set it before, and we'll just click the simulate button. Now you see that the regular visible hair vanishes while the simulation is running, and you can just see the guide hairs. This is the first second as it's settling down into place. I used a little bit more guide hairs than I normally do, so that the simulation's taking just a little bit longer than it normally would, but I still think it's going to be done here in about 45 seconds to a minute. So now it's settled down, and there is the first second done. Now we're going to start to see her turning her head. You're going to immediately see that the hair is bending in a realistic manner. It's brushing against the shoulders. It's reacting to the motion of the atmosphere. There's no wind in the scene. We could add wind, but we're not doing that for this. This is all based on the motion of the character, and presuming that there is an atmosphere of some thickness that the hair is running into as you do it. And there she goes back to the other side. And you see also, you can see that if you look closely, you can see that they're running into that face shield that we talked about before, the oval that is invisible that's over her face. That's keeping her face nice and clear, so she's still just as lovely as ever. And yet she can shake her head vigorously, as it turns out. Or maybe she's lost a small child in the crowd and she's scanning the beach frantically for her charge. Or maybe she's just been asked out on a date, and this is her reaction. It is from side to side. So sad, you've just been shot down yet again. And back to the center. And there we go. Okay, now we go back to the scrub back to the top, and when we do that, we can scrub through, and you'll see the visible hairs, and you can do without even having to render the animation. Sometimes you can just play through and get an idea of how the hair is moving, whether it's realistic to your purposes or not. You can just do this in the assembly room and save yourself some time. But this does skip frames, or when it doesn't skip frames, if you set it so it doesn't skip frames, which is this little button here, if that's not X'd out, then it won't skip any frames. So it might go a little too slow for you to tell what the realistic motion actually is. And it really doesn't take too long to render. Now normally I render with the proxy visible and the V4 invisible, and that's how I get those really fast, 5-minute renders. This time, because I'm curious, I'm just going to render the Victoria 4 as visible and see how it comes out. It will go a little slower because I've got subsurface scattering on her, and I've got some reflection and a lot of transparencies in the eyes, reflection on the lips and in the eyes, some blurry reflection on the skin, and some highlights and other things, bumps and all that kind of stuff that is not on the low poly model. That will slow down the render, but it won't be appreciable. So I'm going to pause it here, and we'll come back with that final render. All right, we're back, and we just rendered that through. It took a little longer. Like I said, about a little more than twice as long. It's still not very long, but mostly because I decided to use Victoria 4 instead of the proxy figure. Most of the time for these hair tests, I recommend you just do this proxy figure so that you can see how the hair is flowing, because we don't really need, especially an animation of a Victoria 4 with her arms in the T position, shaking her head as her face looks on blankly. It's not something that we're likely to need, but let's see how it came out. Pretty good. Let me put it on loop there so you can see. Now, again, we're going to go into the hair shader itself and making it look less shiny metallic-y. And some of this glittery sort of striping that you see there, it may not be easy to see on your screen, but there's some anti-aliasing that's going on, or the fact that it's not particularly high anti-aliasing in my particular render settings. All we're really looking for is the motion of the hair, and does that behave realistically? And I'd have to say, in my opinion, it does a fantastic and stellar job. So I think we found some good settings. I like these settings quite a bit, but this does not mean that they are the be-all or end-all for all hairs and for all scenarios. This will work very well with this particular simple hair, but we are going to make some more complex hairs a little later on in a following tutorial. Let me just stop this, and I'm going to show you some of my test renders. Well, there's my two that I did. So let's just go through these in turn so you can sort of see why I arrived at the conclusion that some of the settings that I've chosen are good settings. And to demonstrate that, let's go back in the render room, and I'll talk about the differences in some of these test renders. So particularly I'm showing you some renders that were done with these parameters changed. So the very first one here is what a similar scene setup. This is not the same setup and not the same hair, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes. This one has 0% stiffness of the hair and 0% air damping. And hold on to your hats. This is what it looks like. Wow. Okay. So it kind of turns into an octopus on top of her head, or some dreadlocks that are attacking everything, and so she's Medusa, you know. it's just insane. But this actually does demonstrate visually how the loose hairs will follow the guide hairs and why the guide hairs are important. So you can see it's not like they're all grouped exactly on that guide hair. It's more like they're all sort of stuck together to some degree. And so that's kind of how the guide hairs work. It sort of demonstrates this, but obviously this is not the kind of settings you would ever use, really ever, that I can think of. So I'm going to stop that. I'm going to try the next one along, which I did this one with 100% stiffness of the hair. By the way, all of these have the 80% stiffness of the root of the hair. I think that's important, and it's a good thing to retain. I did one later on that I'll show you that had no stiffness of the root as well, and I think you'll see why. But this one had 100% stiffness of the hair, but still 0% air dampening. So let's take a peek at this one. Whoa, whoa, whoa. If anything, this one's even wilder than the last one. And it actually seems to swing in areas that it doesn't seem to make necessarily logical sense. At least this one, with it swinging around, it sort of made logical sense that it might swing in those directions. We got some random reach up for the sky grabs there in the back, and the reason for that is when you set the stiffness really high, then all it takes is for one little link in the chain to catch on something, and the chain just sort of is going to fling out like a stiffened like a chain that's frozen, and so it just gets even weirder. So obviously the air dampening, both of these I think prove that air dampening is a very important effect to have up high rather than down low, and that the stiffness of the hair cannot correct that. So we're going to leave that alone. And the next one that I did was with 0% stiffness and 100% air damping. And it's good, it's fine, it's just a little sluggish. Now this particular setting would be good if we had maybe just very little gravity or no gravity in the scene, because you can reset that in the scene tab. This might be a great setting for someone that's underwater, because you see how it's kind of sluggish, but it is being drawn through. And if we had zero gravity, if she sort of just floated there and maybe dropped down just a nudge, you'd see all the hair sort of fly up in slow motion, and maybe she pushes forward. I'm going to do a sim like that just to see if these are not good underwater settings. But that air dampening up to 100%, you can see it's just a little too sluggish on the hair. So sluggish, in fact, that you see that the separation of the various, you see it sort of grabbing onto it so much that it sort of pulls the separate guide hairs away from each other and into sections. So good, but not what we want for a regular scene. This one I did with 100% air dampening and 100% stiffness. I wondered if how that would work, or how that would look. And it actually does something weird at the end here, which is where it seems to retain some of the motion and just pushes that out because of the stiffness of the hair. It seems to retain the force, the centrifugal force, even beyond where it's applied. So I concluded from this that stiffness may have its place, but it's not particularly desirable. I think the risks and the downside of stiffness outweigh the benefits for most styles of hair. I think shape is the better one to use if you need a hairstyle to preserve its shape as it goes. Let's see, is this the one? I think this is the one where I turn the root stiffness all the way down to 0 to see what would happen. And you can already see that with the root stiffness down, there's no push-up effect from the scalp. It just lays straight down to the point where it's not that we can't just worry about just that center stripe being covered with a hair cap to make it not look like she's balding. It will let the scalp show everywhere up on top there. You see it on the corners as she turns, because the hair is it lays straight down and it just slides all over it, and it shows how thin the hair can be. So I think the root stiffness is an important one to keep, and it's the only one I think that is set right. Okay, so this is pretty much going to conclude this part of the tutorial, because it is midnight, or past midnight where I'm at, and I've got to get up really early to go to work tomorrow, so I'm going to leave it here. It's not that I don't have more to show you, because we are going to do a whole nother tutorial about a much more complex hair that doesn't need the face shield and has different parts and what have you. But I think this is a nice stopping point for this simple hair tonight. And if you do nothing else but other than to set up a scene similar to this with a low proxy figure that you can render quickly, then you can jump into the hair room and not be afraid to play around with some of these parameters and see what kind of effects you get. And then you might want to play around with some of these tools as well. One further note before I go that is crazy cool is that if I was to take this this Victoria 4 and this Victoria 4 proxy object, to say I had them all grouped together, and I dragged them all over into my objects tab to save them, it bakes in the hair sim into the hair, which means that you can take a single character and do their entire animation just by themselves, then drag them into the object tray until you get it exactly like you want it at low settings. Just drag it into an object and it will remember every bit of the animation movement, including the hair sim, and then you can reapply that into another scene with many other figures, and you're already ready to go. You don't have to wait for multiple figures to have their hair sims, and you know you've already got everything exactly like you want it. I think that would be, I'm not an animator, but I would think that's very useful to animators. And speaking of the fact that I'm not an animator, you may say, well, all of this is great if I wanted to animate hair, but I just want to do still renders and have realistic hair. The truth is you can stop the frames at any point here and do a render with high settings, and you will get in the most realistic hair in the business that you can get. It just blows everything away, and you can do things. You can do things that you could have her, like I said, run her fingers through her hair and just tuck it behind her ear, and maybe have the pose where she's tucking it behind the ear and looking coyly at the camera. And you could never get even the best. I've got several prop and figure hairs that have that morph of tuck behind ear. It never looks exactly right, and it never looks entirely realistic. Whereas with this, you could actually have an incredibly realistic still render with this technique. So my encouragement is don't be frightened of the hair room. It is your friend. And I realize that this is more than an hour's worth of tutorials, and I took a while explaining the concepts, but really I hope that after watching this, it's very simple for you to open up a test scene so you can jump in there and play and start refining your own settings and start making your own hairs, because this is something that you guys, if you have Carrera, it's a crime if you don't use the Carrera hair. It's just the most realistic thing possible. In my opinion, you could render just a hair pass as a multi-pass and import that, say, into Octane for Carrera plugin, and you would have just the most realistic renders that are possible in the hobbyist world. It would blow anything else in comparison away. So just wanted to hopefully open your eyes to that. And this is John Stark saying that's all for now, but we will be back as soon as I have time to put together a second tutorial with more advanced hair and more features to show you. Thanks, and thanks for listening.